the corporations that exist in our society are increasingly not on the side of the American nation state and the American people who live in it, right? So I think in the 1950s, General Motors could say with a mostly straight face, what's good for GM is good for America. Can we really say in 2021 that's what's good for Disney is good for America? What's good for Google is good for America? I don't think so. In fact, those companies are much more willing to work with the Chinese Communist Party than they are with their own government. I worry that we are living in a world where these multinational corporations have way too much power. The only movement that can actually push back against them is the American conservative movement, but we haven't quite caught up to just how dangerous they actually are. And my view on this is that we have to be willing to actually push the strings financially and go after these institutions, right? Disney is able and willing to do the things that it does. Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post is willing to and able to do the things that he does because there's really no financial consequence for doing it, right? We give these companies, we give these institutions tax breaks, liability protections, a whole host of economic benefits under the theory that they're going to do two things. They're going to build products that make it better for Americans, and they're going to employ Americans in good wages and good jobs. Well, if neither of those things are true, if the products they're selling at the Washington Post or at Disney is active disinformation, and they're increasingly willing to ship American jobs overseas to be done by Chinese slaves, then why are we giving them these economic benefits in the first place? Now, there's a certain part of a conservative mindset that recoils and again says, well, these are private companies. This is none of the government's business. Well, what is the government's business if not protecting America and its people from hostile foreign actors? And increasingly, that's how we have to think of these companies, not as private American businesses, but as hostile multinational actors. If we do that, a lot of the public policy that we need to pursue actually flows from that basic recognition.
And I'm with you on that, but how do you convince people, particularly elected people in Washington, who knows that if we start taking bold steps in this way, it's going to have a short-term financial hit for some of these big companies? And people don't like that. The stock market dips. A lot of people get insecure left, right, and center. And it's one of those things where we're not looking at the medium term, much less the long term, right, I think, at this point. And this speaks to what you're talking about with China and how we made the decision with our trade policies. We're going to get a bunch of made in China crap instead of making good stuff here because it's going to cost a little more.
Right. Well, how do you do it? I mean, that's a very tough question, right? I mean, part of the answer is I think you elect better people, folks who care about this stuff. But I also think you just have to be willing to make the argument to a lot of, I mean, look, do we want to live in a long-term corporate oligarchy where you can't speak your mind without getting fired? I mean, if BlackRock buys up all the single-family homes, I mean, you're not allowed to rent a BlackRock home unless you fly the BLM or the LGBTQ flag outside your door. I mean, this is where we're heading. We're heading to a place where you have to do what woke corporations want you to do to be able to live a decent life in this country. That's not freedom. And so we have to choose. Do we want freedom? Do we want an American way of life? Or do we want short-term satisfaction for every little thing? I think we're increasingly in a situation where we're going to have to choose between one or the other. We're going to have to get a little uncomfortable on some of these things. We're maybe going to have to be willing to pay a little bit more for certain consumer goods. We may even have to be willing to attack some of the companies financially that are waging war on the American people. That's tough, but I don't see any other way out of this except for through it. I mean, if we've learned anything from the last 3 or 4 months, it's that these companies work in concert with the government now, thanks to the Biden administration, to actively make it harder for people to live good lives in this country. The most obvious and ridiculous example of the last couple of months, of course, is what they did in Georgia, right? Basic, I would say a moderate, common sense piece of voter ID legislation in Georgia attacked by every major corporation in this country. What do you want? Do you want free and fair elections? Or do you want to bend the knee to Coca-Cola, to Delta, and to big tech? We increasingly live in a world where we have to choose one or the other.